Welcome to Divine Decode, the space where consciousness meets courage. I am your host, Pragya, and today we are diving into a topic that touches so many lives, the line between breakdown and breakthrough. Our guest, Sean Blackwell, is a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator and author of Bipolar Awakening, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder. For over a decade, he's helped people uncover the emotional, spiritual roots of the- I'm so sorry. Can I begin again? I'm so sorry
Sure,
for
of
the
course.
disruption. Yeah.
Sure.
Welcome to Divine Decode, the space where consciousness meets courage. I'm your host, Pragya, and today we are diving into a topic that touches so many lives, the line between breakdown and breakthrough. Our guest, Sean Blackwell, is a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator and author of Bipolar Awakenings, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder. For over a decade, he's helped people uncover the emotional and spiritual roots of what we call mental illness, showing that sometimes what feels like falling apart is actually life calling us to awaken. And Sean, thank you for being on our show, and it's such an honor to host you today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, to start with it, Sean, many of us, we've gone through moments that felt like we were losing control, anxiety, panic attacks, emotional overwhelm, and sometimes even identity crisis. I know these are stronger words to use, but a lot of people they go through it nowadays, and it's out there. They love to share it. So I would like to know your journey through it when you went through your own bipolar awakening. What shifted in you that made you realize that this wasn't just an illness, but it was also a spiritual process in disguise? And yes, how was that journey, and what led you through it?
Yeah, so for me, my book is actually about me helping others and helping them work through their journeys. But it started with my own process in 1996. I was at an intensive self-help seminar, and there was a focus on a fear meditation, 5-minute meditation. And during that time, I remembered a scuba diving accident that I had had 2 months earlier. And when I remember that accident, there was a punch in my chest, and I felt all this energy overwhelm me, and I began to cry a lot, and I felt fear. And when that was over, that whole fear meditation and that cathartic process ended, I had all my senses had become stronger, and I had a sense of knowingness, like I finally knew things about the world I didn't know, and a sense of oneness, almost like the Buddhist concept of samadhi, and all of that came through. That extreme emotional cathartic process continued for 5 days until I came to the conclusion that I had died in the scuba diving accident. And at that point, I was taken to the psychiatric hospital by police because the course was taking place in a hotel ballroom, and I had gone into a next door ballroom and taken off all my clothes and was trying to find a way to get to heaven by moving through the floor or moving through walls, this kind of thing. And I thought I was being tested by God and I needed to go in a pure state. And so that's why I took off my clothes. And when the police came, I refused to get dressed. And so they put me into an ambulance and took me to the psychiatric hospital. And I still thought I was being taken to heaven or something similar, like nirvana, something like that. But, within a few days, I started to figure out that, it wasn't really shifting, and that sort of broke the delusion, and they weren't being particularly nice to me. It certainly didn't seem like heaven, and that delusion started to break down, and I was lucky enough to be able to go home after 4 days. Now, they had said that I may have had schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but for me, it was always a spiritual process. I felt better than I had for the previous, oh, maybe in my whole life. It was just a huge breakthrough. And I always accepted it as a spiritual experience. And then I didn't want to go see a psychiatrist again or a psychologist, and I never did, and I was never medicated again. I went back to work about 5 months later, and I was doing much better at work. My salary tripled over the next 3 years, going from $30,000 a year to $100,000 a year within 3 years. So my career took off. And in that period, I learned about a concept from a Czech psychiatrist named Dr. Stan Grof, and he had the term spiritual emergency. And what he said was that in a spiritual emergency, a person can go through something that seems like schizophrenia, but is actually good for them. That can be very beneficial. It's just a spiritual experience that we haven't been able to integrate. And so we get confused. And I had all the symptoms of that. And so from there, it was easy for me to recognize that my own intuitions were correct and that I had had a spiritual experience that psychiatry, from my perspective at that point in 1996, 1997, psychiatry simply misunderstood a spiritual experience that I was going through. A decade later, I would learn that it was more complex than that, but that's how it started for me.
What a journey. And thank you for sharing your journey with us, Sean. That is so, so moving. And it genuinely reminds us, and not by us, others don't mean like, just the ones listening and the other ones. It's for everybody, that sometimes breakdowns, they aren't endings, they become breakthroughs in motion, and they can lead you up to paths and spaces where you never imagined yourself to be in, and sometimes better for you. So thank you for sharing your journey.
Yes, and as terrifying as it was for my family, it was a massive breakthrough for me. It was very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. um Sean, in a world where we're constantly running and rarely breathing deeply, right? We're running from this work to that work. Holotropic breathwork, it sounds both ancient and radical to me. Um, so how does something as simple as conscious breathing help people release what's buried deep inside? It might be grief, it might be guilt, or even trauma, and sometimes we don't just see that. So how can conscious breathing help you through that?
Okay. Well, in 2013, so many years after this experience that I was telling you about, I started a private healing retreat for people with bipolar disorder because in 2007, a few years earlier, I had started to work with my wife's nieces here in Brazil. Okay. And they were going through processes similar to what I went through, but it was being labeled with bipolar disorder. Okay. And after a lot of studying, I came to see that there were some pioneering psychologists like Stan Grof who had seen psychosis as actually an intended reorganization of the psyche. Like when people have a break with reality, that they're actually trying to reset their minds in a sense. It's not a broken brain, it's a brain that's attempting to have a breakthrough. Uh, And in Grof's work, he had developed this technique of holotropic breathwork where in his past, he had done in the 1960s, he was one of the final pioneers to do psychedelic therapy. And but that was made illegal in the 70s. And so he looked for other alternatives to psychedelic therapy, which he had seen as having great potential. And he actually looked at the inspiration of the mystics of India who had talked about the breath. And he had also seen that some people, when they were in psychosis, would spontaneously start to accelerate their breath, and that it seemed to help them get better. They seemed to improve after these periods. And I had seen that with one of my wife's nieces, that she started to accelerate her breath in a period of healing where I was supporting her without medication, right? So there's not a whole lot of time to tell that story here, but eventually I created a private healing retreat for people so that they could go into non-ordinary states in the service of their own healing. And what took them there was this accelerated breathing technique. Okay. So we're not talking about simply deep breathing for relaxation or for inner peace or meditation. We're talking holotropic breath work is a technique that involves a safe setting, very safe setting, and a trained facilitator and powerful music. Then the person is on a yoga mat, and when they accelerate their breath, after about 5 to 20 minutes, they will go into a spontaneous, non-ordinary state of consciousness. In that process, they will start to feel um, emotions come up. Often they'll feel emotions come up and maybe visions. They'll have things come up from their unconscious. And when that comes up, it's rooted in their own trauma. Okay. So, or most of the time it's rooted in trauma. And so they're encouraged to express that on the mat physically and vocally, like moving around, shaking, gyrating, kicking, vocalizing, making noises that make you sound almost like an animal in many cases. Okay. So often when people think of breath work and divinity and spirituality, they think of the positive side. They think of spirit and oneness and connection, very similar to my own first experience. But with breath work, you are bringing up trauma that is at the root of disorder, but that in fact everybody has. And in those moments, the breath work is bringing up experiences that can be extremely angry, violent, um, frustrating, painful. And the trained facilitator is there to encourage you to go through that process without hurting yourself. Uh, you know, that's the short version. Okay.
Hmm, hmm, hmm. Oh my God, that is fascinating. And it's like, the breath, it becomes a bridge between survival and surrender. And that is what I take from your story today. And it's so simple, just your breathing techniques and just focusing on, staying calm a bit, like for a minute even, and having that deep breath. And that works wonders. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I know it's a bit of a different paradigm than when people typically think of spirituality and consciousness and calm and things like this, but there is a side, and this really comes from the work of Ken Wilber. He's an American who realized that in in Eastern spirituality and through Hinduism and Buddhism, you do have a very accurate understanding of the spiritual dimension related to everyday life. The chakra system, for example, the Kundalini, you know, these are all Eastern insights. But in the West comes this understanding of the shadow, and the shadow is the parts of ourselves that we don't really own, the parts that are kind of dark, disturbing, things that we don't want to look at. Okay. And so what we have today, especially in Western society, we have people going through what you might call a spiritual bypass, which is they kind of gloss over the problems in their lives with spirituality and say, oh, love and peace and harmony and this kind of thing. And that's great. But then when it comes to their own troubles, their own past, the parts of their life that they don't want to look at, they kind of ignore it. When you go into breath work, like holotropic breath work and the style that I did on my retreat, that's where these darker parts come up, which Carl Jung called the shadow. And when you're able to release those places in within you, then you come to a real deeper, lasting peace. You know, that's where the real healing is.
That's actually very true, and that's beautiful. So many people, they feel dependent on medication just to feel normal sometimes, as we discuss, breathing patterns and everything. And there is this part of society that is very much dependent on medication. Even for normal things, they just go out for that. So you've seen individuals move beyond that, and not through denial, but through deep self work, you've seen them go through it. So, what inner practices make that kind of transformation possible, wherein you are dependent on your own, self work, and you're dependent on your thinking, your practices, your everyday practices, to be a better person or to be normal in some days and some events. So yeah, how is it, and what is that transformation?
Um, I think the best way to answer your question is to tell you how is this healing taking place during this work? Like how is because that's where the transformation takes place. And what happens is when you overbreathe like that and the unconscious material comes up, it's a divine intelligence that's bringing it to the surface. And working with people in a retreat format, for example, like I do, you see that intelligence unfold day after day after day in a very interesting way because people are not used to going into these sorts of processes. So, for example, in the first 3 days of a typical retreat, the material that comes up can be quite calm. People can have pleasant experiences. People can come back from a breathwork session and be like, wow, that was very nice. And I feel so refreshed. And I had memories from when I was a child. But then you get into days 5, 6, and 7, and the material gets stronger. And things like birth trauma can come up, things that happened to you when you were being born, really harder material. And then near the end of the retreat, things get quieter again. And even if people want to continue, bring up more difficult material, things will settle down. The energies involved will move from the Kundalini energies will move from hot to cold. And by the 10th day, the client really has nothing left. They're exhausted, you know. And from that exhaustion, they settle into a place of deeper peace, right? So the transformation is taking place in the way I described through a divine intelligence, a God, basically, that knows exactly who's involved, exactly where you're at, and what's going on. And the key to this sort of healing is to surrender to the entire process and allow this intelligence to take over. And that can be a very scary thing for people because we always want to be in control, right? And so the bigger picture in a sort of philosophy of life sort of way is to pay attention where you're trying to hang on to control and to stay in control and stay in charge and think you know what you're doing and allow those deeper feelings to emerge and kind of let go of that. And that's where the breathing can help, I think, in daily life as well. When deeper meditation practices where you're doing breathing processes, this can help in that way.
That's actually a very important framework that you've shared with us, and thank you for that. Also, as we talk about medications, we talk about treating, and we also talk about mental illnesses. Let's talk about bipolar, right? So, a diagnosis like bipolar, it can feel like a life sentence, and it's terrible. So, people start to see themselves only through that label. How do you help someone reclaim their identity, to see that what they're experiencing, it might actually be part of a sacred unfolding and not just a flaw, and that it might become something which would open up different doors for them, and it's not just their default or their flaw or their illness. So how do you take people through it?
Mm. Well, the first thing I did back in 2007 was I started to make some YouTube videos about the spiritual dimension of bipolar disorder because when most people are into what you would call an acute psychosis, a break with reality that gets often labeled as bipolar disorder, sometimes schizophrenia. They There's only about 13 spiritual delusions that people have, thinking that they're a messiah like Jesus or Buddha or Krishna, believing that they're dead, dying, or being reborn, thinking that they're on a special mission here to save the earth. These are the kind of ideas that people have, and there's really only 13 of them. And so when I put those into a video, people realize that, wow, this guy knows what I went through. And that means that it's not crazy, because people are taught that when they go into psychosis, they have a broken brain. And that's not the case. They're going into some deep um, archetypal patterns that we all go into, like thinking that you're the Messiah, or, like you're here to save the world. And so that was very validating for a lot of people to see that side of things, because that meant that they were not crazy. They didn't have this thing. Um, and then on the other side of things, I think just the healing work itself, the healing work itself takes people to a place of deeper awareness and deeper peace. And that brings another level, a whole other level of the meaning of my work, or of the work. You're releasing traumas that people have had in their lives. And, I've had people get up off the mat with their eyes were different. I mean, their eyes had light in them when before their eyes were flat. When you see that happen to somebody, it's transformational for them, and it's also transformational for me.
That's beautiful. And shifting the story from shame, it adds up so much meaning to people's life, and that's truly amazing. And I'm glad that you do this for them. And it's a process. It's a very simple process, but it looks tougher, and it is tougher when it's done. So kudos. 'Cause yeah.
As I used to have a line on my website, it might still be there, where I said, "Healing is simple, but it's not easy. It takes courage to open up like that, but the door is simple. It's a simple place that anybody could go to if they had the courage."
So true, so true. And that's what needs understanding, and that is what needs awareness. And thank you for, sharing this on our platform, through which, the listeners, they get the idea, and they are at ease that, okay, there is a way where you can open doors for yourself. And as we talk about listeners, I want to know, like, for someone who is listening right now, who feels lost in their own mind, who's maybe ancient, anxious, and medicated, or just numb, or just burnt out even sometimes. So, what would you say to help them believe that healing is possible, and it is the tagline that you shared with us. It's beautiful, right? So, what are what are the ways, and what is that one thing that they need to do that opens up a door for themselves or them?
Sure. Well, I think the first step can be just simple validation. And a lot of people have received validation just by watching my videos on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel called Bipolar Awakenings. It's on YouTube. And particularly the videos I made at the beginning of this journey, people have found very validating. And that at least gives people hope. And that's a good start. All right. So if they want to take a look at those YouTube videos, they're terrific. They've got, some of them have 500,000 views. Taking a look at that. And then for people who want to work with me closer or want to read my books, all of my material is available through my website at bipolarawakenings.com. Both of my books are free as a free PDF. They're available on Amazon, but they're as a free PDF as well. So you can get Bipolar Awakenings, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder, right on my website, bipolarawakenings.com.
That's great. That's great. And thank you for that very simplistic but very compassionate wisdom and insight of yours. And what a powerful exchange with Sean Blackwell today. Um, you have reminded us that, healing the mind, it begins with honoring the soul and just simple work. And your work is a living invitation to rethink everything we know about mental illness and to see awakening where the world once saw disorder, right? That this was amazing. Thank you so much, Sean, for being on the show. And to our listeners, this was Divine Decode. I'm your host Pragya, signing off for today. Until next time, breathe deeply, stay curious, and keep decoding the divine with new